Okay, I just have to remove this little thing from my screen. Anyways, it's stuck on there. Well, good morning, everyone. It's I hope everybody can hear me. If great, I see some thumbs up there, so that's great. I know with technology, as Jim has alluded, it's a bit dicey or tricky at times. So if for some reason or other I'm either speaking too fast or not loud enough, just Jim could shoot me a message. So that's good. Anyways, we have read some words here from Matthew, the tail end of Matthew 11. And I'm just going to read part of that again, just to refresh our memories on this. So I'm going to start at the tail end of Matthew 11, verse 28. So just 3 short verses here. I still got the screen thing showing on my. Let's see if I can get rid of that because it sort of bothers me.
Let me
You
ask
just have to press OK. It should just say this meeting's be recorded, and then you just press OK.
Yeah. All right. I won't be distracted by it. Don't worry. Okay, so let's read the last 3 verses here. Come to me, all you who are labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So I think what we have here is an offer that's been given to us by our master, that he will share at least half the load if we team up with him. Probably in reality, he's going to be sharing about 90% of the load in our lives if we really put our faith and trust in him. I know, like, the analogy of this yoke analogy is an interesting analogy that probably we're maybe not too familiar with in part of the world in which we live. We don't see animals yoked together much anymore. I think in other parts of the world, though, this is still being carried out. But it is an interesting analogy. I know my father, he was a farmer for a few years of his life. I would say maybe 15 to 20 years. Now, he did not have oxen that were yoked together, but he used horses, if I recall. I remember him telling me stories about that. Horses were, of course, harnessed together. They weren't yoked, but they had devices that kept them together. And I remember him telling me once that if they were to bring in a newer animal and to train it, they'd always pair it with a seasoned, more mature horse that could be sort of a teacher for the more younger, inexperienced animal. And by doing so, they would be able to work together better. And I thought that was kind of interesting analogy that Jesus is using here, is that here we are, he's asking us to yoke with him. He's the mature person. We're often the immature person, the one that's learning. As he says here, you're going to be able to learn from me when you yoke with me. So I think we can take from this that we need not to take the burden of life on solely by ourselves. And that is that he will work with us in all of our life. And to team up with him is perhaps the operative phrase here. Now, he doesn't put it that way, of course, yet we know this is what he's inferring about, is to team up with him. He wants us to share his way, a yoke and a burden that is easy and light. And of course, by doing so, we learn his ways. He says, learn from me. And 2 animals that are yoked together will adapt to each other to work step by step as a team. And as we have just mentioned, we're the sort of the proverbial younger person in the team, no matter how old we are. I'm getting on in age, let's face it, but I'm still learning. I got to learn each day from what the Lord has given me. And by learning that way, I become yoked with Him. And the mature person, as Jesus is, He will always pass on His abilities, His maturity to us as we yoke with Him. So these words about yoking and sharing and walking together sort of lead us into chapter 12. Chapter 12 sort of leads off into another tack, as it were, about learning from Jesus. What can we learn from this chapter 12? In actual fact, I'm just going to be more or less focusing on verse 1. When I started out this exhortation, I didn't really plan it that way, but you know how it is when you start an exhortation. Sometimes you don't really know exactly where it's going, but this is where it led to. So in verse 1 of chapter 12, it opens up by saying, at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and the disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. Now, I got looking at this verse 1 here, and there's some interesting concepts in this opening verse. And I've kind of broken them down into four sections there. So number 1 is, this is what I came up with. You folks might come up with something different, but the first point I came up with is that Jesus is doing the leading. He doesn't say it that way, but you can't imagine anything else but Jesus leading the way. He chose to go through the fields of grain. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is he is leading them where there's food. Point number 3, there was hunger with the disciples. It says that they were hungry and they started to eat the grains, the heads of grain here. This word hunger comes from the Greek, meaning to be famished or figuratively to crave. And it seems like the disciples were sufficiently hungry that they decided that they would start breaking out the kernels of grain in their hands and eating them. And then the final point, 4, is that it was the Sabbath. So I got thinking about these 4 points here that I sort of came out of in this verse here. And I figured that in some sense, these 4 items are disciplines that we as followers of Jesus will encounter in our lives. So I kind of changed these 4 points into another way of looking at it, just to help us here. So going back to point 1, about Jesus doing the leading. So I asked the question, do we accept the leadership of Jesus in our lives? Jesus is doing the leading, if we let him, and do we accept this leadership of Jesus in our lives? Point number 2, Jesus will take us where there's food. And I've kind of reworded this. Jesus will always take us where we need to go, not necessarily where we want to go. And that sometimes can be a little bit hard to take at times in our lives. At least I find that personally in my life. Point number 3, this is about the hunger aspect. We will experience hunger in our lives. And I would say that in this Western culture in which we live, we have lots of physical food to eat. We have no shortage of that. So the hunger that we will experience will not necessarily be natural hunger. And And we have to ask ourselves, what will feed that void sometimes that we feel in our lives? What will satisfy the craving that we have often in our lives? And the final point, number 4, had to do with the challenge of the Sabbath that Jesus was going to be challenged on. And taking that to our level today is that in following Jesus, there will be challenges, of course, from others that test the fundamental nature of our calling. So that sort of breaks down those 4 points that what we're going to look at. So let's go back to number 1 here. And that's just to refresh your memory. Number 1 is about Jesus is doing the leading in our lives. Of course, being yoked with our master, he will take us to where there's food, the food we need to sustain us. Now, there's quite an element of trust required in this. The trust that Jesus will take us so that we can be satisfied, that he will take us and provide for us in our lives. And of course, when you look at where he was taking the disciples here, he was taking them through the grain fields. Now, this is really, when you look at it, this is not really a practical or an ideal place for a satisfying meal. We know that Jesus could have provided for them. He could have given them any amount of food in a moment of time, just like he gave the multitudes, the 5,000 and the 7,000, plenty of food, the loaves and the fishes. So Jesus could have provided a lot of food very quickly for his disciples. He could have led them somewhere where the food was good, satisfying, where there was good water. But he didn't do that. Instead, he allowed them to take the dry grain. He had to manually husk it in their palms of their hands. Some versions say corn, but it's not really corn. It's actually kernel grain, wheat, barley, spelt, oats, perhaps, that sort of thing. So this element of trust that we must have is that Jesus will lead us sometimes to the food that we don't naturally want in our lives. It's not the type of nourishment that we think we need. And of course, we know that this was something that Israel struggled with after they left Egypt. Very quickly after they crossed the Red Sea, they came to a place where they were running out of water. And we read about that in Exodus 15. Yeah, if you want to turn that up, you can. If you don't want to, we'll just talk about it a little bit here. But they complained because they found some water, and the water was bitter. They could not drink it. Now, I thought about that for a moment. It doesn't say the water was undrinkable, but it says it was bitter, and they could not drink it. It was so bitter. So, of course, they complained about this, and the Lord showed them a certain tree that they could throw into the water and made the water sweet. Well, I think we can see the analogy here in our lives is that, sometimes the things that we get led to don't taste that good. It's bitter. We might become bitter about what God has given us in our lives. And God will provide the method to bring about the conditions in which things will sweeten up in our lives. And then moving on to Exodus 16, the next chapter, they were hungry and they complained because they had no bread to eat. And they called it light bread and they craved for meat. So eventually they didn't really like the bread that God was giving them. And they complained about it and they wanted meat. Just following through with these Israelites, they followed Moses roughly about a year and a few months later to the edge of the promised land. And there they were at the edge of the promised land. They could stand on the brow of a hill and look down upon it. And they stood on the edge, and yet they would not enter that land. And, that's an interesting thing, is that for some reason or other, they just did not want to go into that land that the Lord had led them to over a year and a half, roughly. And we read about that in chapter 3 of Hebrews, starting at verse 16, where the writer says, "For who, having heard, rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? To those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief." So there we have the unbelief, the lack of trust that God was leading them, in that he could have brought them into the land. But for whatever reason, they did not trust that God had the ability to do that. And one further verse I'd like to look at is from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2. We read here that they were to, now here in Deuteronomy, he's rehearsing what had happened to them for those 40 years. So he's talking now, I believe, to the 20-year-olds and unders that have now grown up and were now adults, mature adults. And he's rehearsing to them what had happened to the fathers. And he says here in Deuteronomy chapter 8, he says, verse 2, he says, "And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you, and to test you, and to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know. He may make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word which proceeds from the mouth of the Lord." So I thought about that little phrase there, to remember all the way which the Lord has led us. So these folks here, he's exhorting them to remember all the way that the Lord had led them. Every aspect of the way they were to recall. And I look at this as more or less as an interesting personal exercise of introspection. We are on a journey too. We may look back on events of our lives and realize that we are being put in those situations in our lives for reasons at the time seem really hard to take. Sometimes we go through things that are really hard to reconcile and to determine what God wants in our lives from us. But just as with these folks, where God says to remember all the way, so we can look back in our own lives, remember how God is working in our lives, sometimes in very difficult circumstances, and know that God is with us. And if we are yoked with him, with his son Jesus, he will help us to make the way easier, and our yoke is indeed easier. And we are to remember all the way of our lives, that he is with us all the way, even through the dusty grain fields of life, and he is providing for us. So let us move on to point number 2. Jesus was, of course, leading these disciples. Now we're back in Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. Jesus was leading them to where there was food, we read that they began to pluck the heads of grain and to eat. Now, we know this is a natural enough reaction where a resource is readily available. If there's food around, you're going to probably get into it and start eating a little bit. Sometimes I'll find myself, I'll be nipping into the fridge at times after supper and grab a little bit of food, and that's kind of nice. It's there. You grab a little bit. I'm not particularly hungry, but sometimes you just want to eat for something to do. That's me, though. But in this case here, the disciples were hungry, it says. And as we noted, the word used literally means to crave, or they were famished. So this word, I believe, has some degree of an intensity with it, linked to it. Now, whether the disciples were really experiencing that type of hunger, it's hard to say. But that's the word that's being used here. And that is, they were hungry. I think it does show that these men that followed Jesus around day after day in and day out, they ate with him, they slept with him, they walked with him, they preached with him. They walked long days, long journeys, long miles. I think it shows that these men that followed Jesus did not have it easy. And to follow their master and the path that he was taking really took a physical as well as a mental toll on them. And they had to take what was available in terms of food. They had to take, as it were, on the fly what was given to them. Now, we know that food is used by Jesus in a lot of his interactions, both private and public, to bring different levels of instruction to those that he talked to. Food is an interesting, instructive subject. We know that food, or appetite, is really fundamental to our survival. And we also know that even with our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, one of his first temptations was that of being hungry. He was driven into the wilderness by the Spirit to be tempted by the devil, we read. And one of his first experiences was after 40 days without eating, he was very hungry. And so he had to resist the temptation to turn stones into bread. And the only way he could do that was he quoted scripture. And he quoted that verse from Deuteronomy that we just read: man shall not live by bread alone. There's another case where being hungry comes up with the disciples, and that is in John chapter 4. Now, John chapter 4, that's where Jesus entered into Samaria, and at that time they were going from the south in Judea, and they're going up to Galilee, and they had to pass through Samaria. The disciples were hungry, and so Jesus and the disciples parted ways for a short period of time, and the disciples, they went looking for food in one of the villages. Now, to look for food at that time, you couldn't just get in your car and drive over to Pizza or go up to Mr. Sub and get a few subs and a few drinks and be back within maybe 20 or 30 minutes. It would be probably a little bit of a walk to get to the nearest village. I doubt whether they'd want to go into a Samaritan village and try to barter for food. So they probably went back to an area where there were their own people. And so it might have taken 2 or 3 or 4 hours for them to come back with this food. But when they returned, hours later, they were quite hungry. Jesus was quite hungry, And I would say that probably on the way back, they probably nipped into the food a little bit just to satisfy themselves. And they urged him to eat. And so he says, no, I have food to eat of which you do not know. So here we have the master. He's been all this time without any food. And he's telling them, well, I have food that you do not know of. Of course, we know this puzzled the disciples. And they asked among themselves, has anybody brought him anything to eat? So, he says, well, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. And then he continues on in John chapter 4, I believe that is. And he says there in verse 35 to 38, he just takes the opportunity to instruct them a little bit. He says, do you not say there are still 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, where they are already white for harvest. And he who reaps receives wages and gathers fruit for eternal life, that both he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labors. Now, this is not to say that Jesus did not need natural sustenance. And I'm sure he was thankful for what was brought to him to satisfy him. But in Matthew chapter 12, in these grain fields, where Jesus chose to take his disciples, he knew they were hungry. And he will provide for us as we walk with him. And I think we can take encouragement that Jesus will provide what we need. And often what we need is not what we think we need. So let's move on to point number 3. And that has to do with hunger. We hear that the disciples were hungry. And we've noted that the word means to famish, figuratively to crave, or actually to pine away. So that's getting at a pretty high level of intensity. And we do know that when we're really hungry, it's probably not something that I have actually experienced in my life, but it will override all other feelings or mental processes and physical processes that we have in our body. Hunger at an extreme level takes over the whole body. It shuts out all other appetites that we might have. And I'm not really saying that the disciples felt that way at this time, but this is how the word is used. Now, I've gone through grain fields when I was younger. I grew up in sort of a farming community, and there was lots of grains growing around, and I've done the same. I've grabbed some heads of grain and wondered what this stuff tastes like. But I've done it more for curiosity, more at a casual level of doing this. And quite frankly, I'm not quite sure how nourishing these dry kernels of grain actually are in the overall scheme of things. Yet I think we can assume that that the disciples were genuinely hungry. It's interesting that there is no record of Jesus plucking the heads of grain. It's just the disciples. So to desire or crave to be filled is the thrust of much of our Lord's teaching. We just talked about the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus starts out with a conversation with her. He gently and very adroitly brings it around to the point where she has to confess that she wants what he can give her. She's thinking of the literal water at first. And she thinks that Jesus can just provide literal water at a moment of time. But eventually she becomes to realize that it's something deeper here, that he can give her more than this literal water. It's something that will satisfy her thirst for the ages to come. Now let's contrast this with the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6. John chapter 6 starts out with the feeding of the 5,000 who were told to sit down, and they were fed with the loaves and the fishes, and there was so much food that they had 12 baskets left over. But we follow along in this account here. After they were being fed the next day, they came seeking Jesus, presumably for another miracle that would satisfy them. So at some level, they were attracted to Jesus. You might say that Jesus could be for some of them, not perhaps all of them, but Jesus was a curiosity. He was perhaps a casual attraction by others. There were others there, of course, no doubt, that saw things a little bit more seriously. But for the most part, they were looking for satisfaction of temporal needs. And Jesus noted this, and he comments on their behavior in this chapter, verse 26 and verse 27. So we're now in John chapter 6. And he says to them, "Most assuredly, I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him." Now, the food that endures unto everlasting life is really the same as the water that Jesus promised the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, that if she were to drink of it, she would never thirst. So these folks here in John chapter 6, they sort of misinterpreted this reply, supposing that some sort of work had to be done. In verse 28, they said to him, "What shall we do that we may work the works of God?" So they took it as, well, I do some works here. I might get something in return. So the transactional deal that they were looking at here. So this discussion seesaws back and forth. They were looking only at natural bread, and all the same time, he was trying to impress on them the spiritual aspect of what they could get out of this. In verse 34 and 35, he says, they said to him, "Lord, give us this bread always." So we can see what they're driving at. They're kind of driving at what the Samaritan woman has said. She said, "Well, give me this water, we'll never have to draw water out of the well again. We don't have to work anymore." So they're saying, "Lord, give us this bread always." But Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." And then finally, Jesus becomes quite blunt, because we're really not getting the picture here. In verses 53 to 58, he says, "This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. He who eats this bread will live forever." Now, at this, of course, their reaction wasn't too optimistic. They took a lot of offense at this. In verse 61, Jesus says, when Jesus knew in himself that his disciples complained about this, he said to them, "Does this offend you?" So, why were they offended? Why did they take offense at the fact that Jesus said, "If you were to eat my flesh and drink my blood, you would have life in yourself"? Was it because this sort of had a reference to some sort of cannibalism or some weird sort of religious sort of activity that Jesus was talking about? Verse 52, it says here that the Jews therefore quarreled among themselves, saying, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" So they really struggled with this concept that Jesus was trying to get to them at this time. Well, their struggle could have deeper roots. It could be another reason in a more universal concept of why we might struggle with this. It has to do with faith. Faith that God will provide over and above the natural. I say this because in the first time you read about the word hunger, it's found way back in Exodus chapter 16, verse 3. We were just reading from that a few minutes ago. So that's found in Exodus 16, verse 3, I believe. Actually, I got a misquote on that. It's actually Deuteronomy 16, verse 3. Now, I'm just going to read that here. Deuteronomy 16, verse 3. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Imagine that. Here they are saying that the Lord went through all the 10 plagues, he delivered them from Egypt, led them through the Red Sea, got over on the other side, they destroyed Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. And then they said, "You just brought us out here to kill us with hunger." They didn't say, "Well, you brought us out here to kill us with the enemy or with the extreme heat that we're just suffering under in this desert, not from exhaustion. You're not killing us with sickness." He's saying they accused him of killing them with hunger. Now, through Moses, of course, in the next verse, they are told that the Lord would rain bread from heaven. And they should gather a certain quota that I may test them to see whether they will walk in my law or not. So this certain quota is interesting. It's a literal amount that they were to gather up, a physical, literal amount, a certain quota. And that tells us that God knew what they needed. He knew the exact amount that they needed of this physical food to survive. If they gathered not enough up, they wouldn't get enough energy from it, and they'd start to pine away and die of malnutrition. If they gathered too much up, well, it was just a waste of time, and if they kept it over, it would breed worms. So it's exactly interesting that he would use the phrase that they were given an exact quota. God knew what they needed. And it says that he would test them. So he was testing to see if they were listening to him. And of course, they did test him, because we read in Psalm 78 that they tempted God in the wilderness, and they said, "Oh, can you provide a table in the wilderness for us? Can you provide food for us? Can you give us bread? Can you give us meat?" And it says they tested God in their heart, and he provoked him to anger. Now, jumping ahead to John chapter 6. John chapter 6, these were the ancestors of the people that Moses had talked to. But these ancestors now were the ones that Jesus was talking to in John chapter 6. And so let's go back to this faith aspect here. It took the same amount of faith to believe that God would provide, just as he did with the folks in the wilderness, as with the folks that Jesus was talking to. Jesus was asking them to take the leap of faith, to believe in him. He says, do not labor for the meat that perishes. Now, I was thinking about that in my own personal life. Now, this can be risky from a human standpoint. Now, from a human standpoint, we want to make sure everything's tied up and secure and we're all provided for. To think that God can provide for us, apart from what we can provide for ourselves, from a human standpoint, that can be risky. We like to rely on our own natural means for what we can provide for ourselves. But I'd like to dwell just a bit on that certain quota business here that the Israelites were to gather up. They were told to gather up a certain quota of physical manna. And how does that fit into our lives today? We know that the manna refers to Jesus and the life that he can give us and the instruction he can give us and the food that comes from him. With him, there's no restriction into what we are to gather, as it was with the manna. There's no restriction. In other words, we are not told to read 3 chapters of the Bible a day, maybe pray for 5 minutes a day, maybe sing a hymn or 2 a week. We can read as much as we want to. We can pray as much as we want to. And we can study as much as we want to, or as little as we want to. There's no quota. It's up to us. In Luke chapter 6, we read, "Blessed are you that hunger now, for you shall be filled." But a few verses down it says, "Woe unto you that are full, for you shall hunger." And in Ephesians 3, verse 20, we read, "Now unto him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us." Now, that's an interesting verse, because whatever we think, whatever power that is within us, whatever desire we have, God is able to do far more than that, exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. So just returning to that chapter 6 of John here, we read there, unfortunately, that many disciples left Jesus after that. They didn't like what he was saying, or they didn't understand what he was saying. It offended them. Verse 60, we read that they said, "This is a hard saying. Who can understand it?" And then Jesus asked the 12 that were remaining, in verses 67, verse 68, he says, Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also want to go away?" But Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." So let's move on to the last point, and that's the point about the Sabbath that we're brought up in this Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. It says here that Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But it was the Sabbath. Now, how does this fit into the picture in this verse? This was a Sabbath day. This was supposed to be a day of rest. Originally intended to provide rest from 6 days of labor, even as God rested on the 7th day. Matthew 11, verse 2. It was pointed out to Jesus by the religious leaders that they said, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." So by this time in Israel's history, religion had really developed into something that was far from what God intended. it become very law-based. It may be taken 700 or 800 years for this to develop, which is a long time. It was law-based. It was far removed from the spirit of the law originally intended. And this was something that Jesus had to constantly address and to correct, which contributed to his, of course, ultimately being taken and crucified, because they did not like what he was saying. And he quotes from Hosea the prophet in verse 7 and 8 here in this chapter, which means, of course, as to how long this had been going on and how long these law-based ideas had been developing since the days of Hosea, which was probably 700 or 800 years. He says, but if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, of course, the rest of the chapter here, naturally we don't have time to go into this, but this next to this chapter shows us, I believe, that to follow Jesus is not often an easy task. It's hard, it's difficult. Our Lord Jesus found it very difficult, I believe. He had to counter a lot of things and speak up against a lot of things that were wrong. He had to speak out against the house divided. He came to a house that was divided. It was they accused him of certain things, and he said, "This house is divided. It can't stand. You guys are fighting among yourselves. You're opposing each other. You will not stand if it's like this." He had to counter blasphemy. People were saying that they were blaspheming the moral character of God. They were saying that by the prince of Beelzebub, he was casting out these devils. They were blaspheming the moral character of God and his righteousness by saying that. And Jesus had to talk about them as a tree. And he said, the tree shall be known by its fruit. And if you don't bring forth good fruit, you will be cut down and destroyed. They came also seeking a sign, and they wanted a sign from Jesus. Well, the thing is, Jesus had given them lots of signs, but they had a lack of faith in seeing that the things that Jesus had done proved that he was the Christ. And, finally, and then he talks about the unclean spirit, the house that had been cleansed and then totally cleansed, which I believe probably refers to the destruction of Jerusalem under the Babylonians, and cleansed by them, and then 7 more spirits more evil come in and fill it up, this house. So this end is worse than the first. And probably the last point, which is maybe the toughest one that Jesus had to deal with, was he had to use his relatives as a point of discussion here near the end of this chapter here. And he had to use his mother and his brothers to bring home a point. And they said to him, it says, well, your mother and your brothers are out. They want to talk to you. So Jesus loved his mother and his brothers, no question about that. He had nothing against them, but he uses them as a point of reference here. And, he says, they said, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? And he stretched out his hand to his disciples and said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So just to conclude here, I think what we can take out of this following Jesus, being yoked with Jesus, walking with him, is that it will, of course, bring challenges in our lives. We have to know what will nourish us and what will sustain us in these last days in which we live. And the days in which we live today are tremendously difficult. There's a lot out there that will take us away from Christ as we walk through that kingdom. things will arise in our personal lives that will challenge us. Things will arise in our family lives that will tend to want to take us away from Jesus Christ and the call of the gospel. In our businesses too, there will be struggles if we're running a business. And unfortunately, often things in our ecclesia will test our walking with Jesus. And so we will have to make decisions. We will have to make choices. And we hope that those choices and those decisions will be good choices that we will make. And sadly, sometimes there are partings with our loved ones, the ones that we really love, for whatever reason, whether right or wrong. But remember, we are yoked with Jesus. We are walking with him. If we stumble, he will support us. If we are tired, he will pull for us. And when we're yoked with Jesus, we can talk to him, we can lean on him, and he will listen to us, and we can all listen to him. We need not take the burden of life on solely by ourselves, because he will work with us in all of our life. Thank you.